Greetings and welcome to Edgy Ideas, the podcast that explores what it means to live a good life and to create the good society in our disruptive age. My name is Simon Western and I will be talking to invited guests about diverse topics, exploring social conscious and unconscious dynamics and desires. So welcome everybody to Edgy Ideas podcast. I'm delighted to have a special guest, Jeff Klein. Jeff and I are old colleagues and we've been thinking for a long time about technology and culture. Jeff is an analytic network trained coach and he was a co-author of a chapter in Global Leadership Perspectives, a book I edited, and his chapter was on Chinese leadership. Jeff, you're very welcome. Would you like to say something about yourself to the audience?
Yes, sure. Maybe it's good to give a quick introduction of who I am. So I'm originally a sinologist by training, by academic training. I spent the larger part of my life so far in China, within the Chinese cultural space. Not always in academics. Actually, most of the time was spent in technology. I was lucky to witness the technological and digital transformation in China from very close by within the technology industry. Recently, just about a year ago, I moved back to Europe, and I'm still in technology industry, and I'm still like one American comedian said recently, one foot in the east and one foot in the west, and me in the middle doing my best, basically.
That's great, and I've been very interested to talk with you in the past, and I think our audience will really enjoy hearing from you. We're going to explore technology, new technologies, and how it is perceived in different cultures, and how different cultures are prepared to work with the technological pools. And the two pools we've discussed in the past, Jeff, are the technological pool to decentralisation and the technological pool to centralisation. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yes, so these are essentially two opposing forces, if you wish, that exist within technology. We came out of the industrial age, which essentially had become a centralized form of organization and of production methods. The first wave of digital technology was very much based on that. So in IT terms, it was very much server-client. With a server hosting all the data and the clients kind of supplying and using that data. That's very much the infrastructure that we are in still. The cloud, for instance, which is ubiquitous now, is essentially data farms where information is stored. But we also see clearly an opposing force, which is decentralization. Most well known is things like the blockchain, but also you get with more powerful computing, you get the ability to do a lot of computing on decentralized machines. Data is also collected and increasingly processed on small, tiny little computers in the IoT world. And so you see this emerging now, but it's in an opposing force of the other. So it's not like it's necessarily replacing the centralized structure, but it's a push and pull from both sides. And currently, it's not easy to say where the balance will end. But that's kind of what you see happening in technology nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, when all this kicked off, I remember there's quite a lot of utopianism around this decentralization. There was huge opportunities. We could see how it could really democratize many things and empower people at the edges rather than just from the center. And then there's been a real swing in recent years towards the fears of an authoritarian, centralized kind of perspective. What's your views on that?
Well, I think we start where do we come from, and we come from a world that has a lot of centralized structures, banks, government, etc. And in the end, it's also about who holds the technology. So if computing technology gets increasingly more powerful, and from my experience in development centers, both in North California as in places like China, I know that in the coming years, the power of computers is going to grow exponentially much more than what we've witnessed in the recent years and decades. So in the end, it's also a lot about who holds that computer power, but also who holds the data. Because in the end of the day, computers can't do much without data, right? So you can have very powerful computers, but who owns the data? Who owns the powerful computers? Well, if you add those powerful computing capabilities and the data ownership to a centralized structure, I personally think you're looking towards a situation with reduced freedom, if you wish, of individuals, because too much of that data, too much of the computing power is centralized in just a few hands. And in my view, you see this now already with things like social media. This is essentially all within the centralized structure where huge amounts of data is being placed by innocent users in the hands of just a few, but currently still with fairly limited computing power compared to what we will have maybe in 10 years from now. On the other hand, of course, utopia in the decentralized world, well, yes and no. I mean, that's a major paradigm shift. That means that if you're really looking forward to, let's say, a fully decentralized world where ownership of data is decentralized, where computing power is decentralized, basically where the main resources of the future are decentralized, then the incumbents, so the current holders of the data and of the computing power, will have to relinquish that power they have. That's in history. That's never a painless event. Right. So I think there's risk in the paradigm shift. If in the end it turns out, utopias, of course, you never end up in a perfect situation. But if you really want to get there, there's a lot of existing structures that will need to give up a lot of what they have been enjoying so far.
Yeah, I mean, so if you read those critics of what's going on, they talk about two power sources which can hold this data. They talk about the big corporates, your Facebooks and your Googles and your Amazons. And they talk about, on the other hand, totalizing states, and they cite China. So I'm interested in your view from the Chinese perspective. That's a story we get here. There's a totalizing state, the Chinese state, which can use this huge data and technology in a way which is going to be limiting, as do the big corporates. Can you say something about your views on how that could play differently through the Chinese eyes?
I mean, it's not wrong for sure. I mean, the current Chinese state is heavily centralized, and it holds everything that brings power. It basically holds in the hands of a few. So in that sense, it's not wrong. What the perspective that is often missed, though, especially in the Western discourse about China, is of course China, as we know it now, it's part of a civilization, of a culture that has existed for much longer. It's the way the state in China is organized at the moment is the way it's organized in this cycle of its life stages. But if you really look at how Chinese deal with things like technology changes or changes in society, then you see very clearly that the naturalistic elements of Chinese culture, the Chinese culture from origin, and it's still now, is in a way is very naturalistic. I mean, they take things in the flow of nature. That's really the way it's also expressed in China. I mean, a Chinese person kind of like a Chinese garden that lets things wander naturally, and it believes in going with the flow with nature. It believes, traditionally also that states rise or fall, let's say, under the order on the mandate of what they call of heaven, but then on the mandate of nature as well. So if you look at how Chinese deal, for instance, with the technology changes, which have been much stronger so far in China than they have been in many other parts of the world, or any other part of the world, I would say. It's from a Western perspective quite interesting to see how they take these massive changes in their stride without much. Not that everybody immediately jumps into the new technology. Of course, you've got the same technology adoption curve in China as you probably have anywhere else. And some people adopt early, and other people adopt later. But you don't see a very strong countercurrent opposing the new technological changes. They take this as part of nature, and they move along with it rather than trying to resist and reject it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I remember you wrote in that book chapter for Global Leadership Perspectives, you wrote that there was a yin and a yang, that there was the yin of Confucian paternalism and the yang of Taoist holistic thinking, that these two were playing out in China today, and how the Chinese manage paradoxes really interested me as well.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and that's what I was getting to as well. We just discussed the opposing forces of centralization and decentralization in the Chinese way of looking at things. So this very naturalistic way, or this very naturalistic worldview. The paradoxes don't really exist, right? Because everything is seen very much as a unity anyway. So from a Chinese worldview's perspective, where maybe in other cultures, the idea would be that the one would exclude the other. You cannot have paternalism and altruism or something like that in one. But in the Chinese worldview, you can. For instance, if you look at China, the way we look at China from the West, we see this big autocratic centralized states, and you will ask any Chinese, and they will willingly admit that yes, the power is with the CCP and with their group of people. But for them, for many others outside of China, it would mean so it cannot be, let's say, there cannot be any freedom in that country, for instance. But that's wrong. There's tremendous freedom in that country, in the society, in many areas bigger than anywhere else in other societies. That's an illustration of how the Chinese deal with this what we see as paradoxical situations are not paradoxes for them at all. It's just two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and when you're in Europe and in the West and working with Americans, do you see us really trapped in a kind of mindset? Because you bridge both places. Do you see the West very much trapped in a kind of mindset which hinders how they understand the Chinese and how they understand how the Chinese function socially?
Yeah, I think one trap that we in the West seem to be falling continuously is that we keep thinking in terms of good guys and bad guys. So in black and white, or this kind of Zoroastrian kind of manichaeic kind of worldview that appeared in Persia 4000 BCE type of thing. And that's not part of the Chinese worldview. Of course, in the Chinese worldview, there's also negative forces and positive forces. Like I said, I mean, in the yin and yang, it's also drawn in black and white. But this is not bad guys, good guys. This is just different guys, let's say, or different ends of a particular spectrum. And in the Western discourse nowadays, what I often hear is that the Chinese are being branded as the bad guys, so everything there must then be bad, which is, of course, never true for any society. If you go back to the technology, I think with many people in the West, the impression is that China is kind of is just a surveillance state, that all the technology is just used to control everybody. But that's indeed one part of the story. but it's not the full story. I mean, the Chinese also use technology to, for instance, if you look at payment systems in China, China is essentially already for quite a few years a cashless society. That means that means that's convenience, but it's not just convenience. It means that small business people, and I'm really talking about people selling pancakes on the street, don't have to deal with cash. They do everything is digital. They can do. I mean, they have a lot of leeway and freedom and opportunity to be little entrepreneurs, which they otherwise might have struggled with more in the previous system. Just as a small example. So again, I think if you and I think you're probably going to get to that is. I think the very analytical way of the Western worldview, the kind of Aristotelian worldview, has its benefits, and I think it's good to be able to analyze things and to make things visible. But in the West, we sometimes lack the intuition part. We try to be very analytical and try to find facts for everything, but the reality is that nature is a system. And that sometimes it's not the individual parts that really matter, but it's what happens in the interaction of the parts. And that element is much stronger in Chinese way of looking at the world than it is in the Western way of looking at the world. So we miss a lot of stuff by being over analytical sometimes.
Sure. I went to China I'm trying to remember the year. I think it was probably 93 or something. 1993. I took my young son there, and we turned up and. We wandered around Tiananmen Square, and there was kites flying, and there was thousands of bicycles, and you just started to see kind of the skyscrapers going up. It was just kind of pre this massive change, and it's quite amazing to think that was such a short time ago, and now it's such a huge change in China, such a speed of change. It's quite incredible, isn't it?
Well, yeah, if you look at human history, this is probably the fastest development we've ever seen in the history of humanity. Yeah, so in that sense, absolutely, yes.
When we're thinking about centralization, decentralization, technology, can you just run us through a few of the technologies that we're talking about? Some of the key technologies like 3D computing and AI, and just for the audience to think about kind of some of the key areas of where change is taking place.
Sure. Well, I already mentioned blockchain, which is early stage because computing power is not really enabling it to really happen on a massive scale. This is something for in a couple of years from now. AI is, of course, very well known. Machine learning, especially big data analysis. Machine learning is a good example, again, where we are in the very early stages. We can. AI is something that a lot of people are afraid of because they think it will replace human beings. In reality, machine learning can only, at the moment, is limited to fairly routine tasks, things that a human being will probably take 1 or 2 seconds to think about. These are typical the kind of tasks that machine learning is currently able to replace, and then it doesn't replace human beings, but it enhances human capability, like all human technologies do. Really, of course, because we're talking mostly about supervised learning. If you go to a situation where you have unsupervised learning, so basically the system is able to learn by itself, then maybe the situation might change, but that's not current. I mean, the computers are not sufficiently capable to handle that yet. You need much more computing power for that, and when you have more computing power, you need more electricity too. So you need to have a completely different computing technology to be able to do that. So I think the other one, the 3D, is very interesting as well, because it's often missed when discussing this paradox, if you wish, between centralization and decentralization. But 3D printing has the potential to bring us back, together with all the other technologies, but to bring us back to a situation where we no longer have centralized factories producing everything at mass and then sending it out, but be able, like in the pre-industrial age, to be able to mostly manufacture locally. You can in the pre-industrial age, you could go to your corner shop and get a pair of shoes done or something like that, right? Or get the hoofs for your horse or something like that. That has disappeared with industrialization. It became needed. The big factories need to have scale. So the bigger the factory, the lower the cost per item, and so everything became centralized. Additive manufacturing or 3D printing. Once it reaches a certain, it's developing reasonably fast. Once it reaches a certain level of quality and cost and versatility, you will see more and more workshops appearing again, just in your neighborhood. And you will go to your neighborhood workshop to get, maybe not hooves for your horse anymore, but maybe tires for your car or whatever piece of furniture, or you name it, right? Yeah. So I think that again, and this I find quite interesting, because now with the current situation in 2020, you have already seen the trend of people moving back into their homes, staying near home, accelerating because of the health crisis. But I think this is not a temporary situation. This is really part of the bigger trend of decentralization, because if you have much of the manufacturing, many of the products you need, you can buy them locally. You have the technology available. It doesn't really forces you to go into centralized offices anymore like we have now already. The society will change. Where people live will change. How people live will change. And we've seen this in 2020. We talked about it, Simon, I think in 2018 or something, quite a few years ago. But this year, you've seen this accelerating already. Of course, we didn't anticipate this would happen, but it's not. I don't see this as a one-off special occasion because of this health crisis. This is part of a bigger trend.
Yeah, no, I think it is part of a bigger trend. It's been hugely accelerated because of COVID. We're all kind of working at home and we're having video conferencing now. But there was also, even when we were speaking then, there was farmers markets, and there was that kind of shift to localization within a global kind of perspective. And now with 3D printing, it could really be transformative. What do you think, Jeff, a big organization needs to think about in these terms? We've really, in modernity and the Industrial Revolution, we still operate hospitals and we still operate big corporations really with a machine model in our mind. We still have hierarchies in our mind. There are some leading edge places where decentralization is working. Do you see a decentralization within organizations? Do you see what I call eco-leadership taking place, where there's much more leadership from the edges? There's leaders everywhere in the organization rather than just at the top. Do you see the hierarchies changing in organizational life?
Yeah, I think they are, and they need to. In some societies faster than others. But yeah, I do see this happening as well, forced by the new ways of working. Yes, and again, I don't want to refer to I don't want to give the impression to anybody that I think the Chinese way of looking at the world is in any way better than the Western way of looking at the world. It's definitely not, but I think they're very complementary. If you look at the current situation now, and you see a big difference, currently we are also in an economic crisis, and what you see happening in the Western, at least I'm now in Europe, so let's say the European economies, is that a lot of companies are starting to spin off activities that they see as not core activities. So this is really, to me, because this is what Western companies tend to do. They say focus on your core. This is really an element, an aspect of the analytical way that Westerners look at the world. If you benchmark this to a typical Chinese organization, a few of the famous ones that we know, like Alibaba or Huawei or Tencent or Ant Financial that came out of Alibaba, these are very different companies. They don't have this concept of core activity, non-core activity. They're really very big, complex organic systems. If you look at those, it's very hard to understand those companies, really. If you look at those companies, especially with a Western view, it's very hard to comprehend those companies because it's not so clear. The hierarchy is not so obvious. I mean, there's hierarchy for sure, but they're in different cells. There's also, it's not so clear. I mean, in Western companies, you typically have very clear divisions, and this division and this activity. That's very blurred in those organizations. They really, I mean, I can only describe them as complex organic systems, where things sometimes pop out of, like Ant Financial coming out of Alibaba already a long while ago, but you know, these kind of organizations keep popping up out of Alibaba, a little bit less out of Tencent, a little bit less out of Huawei, but you see in all those organizations, you see constantly new things kind of coming out or shrinking again or appearing again in a very organic and natural way. This is something, I mean, I've also worked a lot in Western companies, both American and European companies. Those companies are not capable of doing that at all, because if you try to set up a new initiative within a typical Western company, the harsh reality is that it hardly ever succeeds. It dies off and it disappears, or it gets sold off if they're lucky, but usually it just dies off. And in those big organic Chinese companies, because especially the Japanese and the Koreans have this also, a little bit more rigid, but a lot more rigid, but it does happen there as well. But in typical Chinese organizations, even in the smaller ones, you see this mix of a very organic, natural way of allowing things to grow and wither. That I think is quite typical for the way that the Chinese deal with their organizations and with the way they organize themselves.
I mean, what I find very interesting in my work, I get taken into companies like big corporations, health companies, education, public sector organizations, and the people who bring me in are leading edge thinkers. They're the ones who have read my books on eco leadership. They want me to think about how to distribute leadership, how to allow clusters to form, how to decentralize, and yet they find it very, very difficult. I'm always struck by even the people who are progressive and really want to start thinking in this way. They find it very difficult to let go of the existing cultures, and they start with goodwill, and then they kind of hit a wall quite often, and they return to what they know, which is the controller leadership, the hierarchies, therapist leadership, you know, kind of small team people. But they find the whole idea of holding on to kind of ecosystems in the mind, technological ecosystems, people ecosystems, natural ecosystems, and working with these as mental models, very, very difficult.
No, I acknowledge it, but I also want to make a note to that based on my own experience, because as you know, Simon, I've always very much subscribed to the eco leadership as well, and I've always done my best to implement that, both in China, in Asia, and now back in Europe. I find it a lot more difficult to do in Europe, and the reason is for me, it's very, and this has been I've only been back for a bit more than a year, so I mean, my thoughts are still progressing on it, but this is my current thesis. It has to do with the expectation of the rest of the organization. In China and Asia, not just China, all of Asia, it goes for Japan as well. Basically, I'm the leader of the organization, and the team. The expectation that the team have of me is also a moral moral leadership. They expect me to be a moral leader because I'm the leader, right? So that by the fact that I'm a leader, I must have some moral qualities. That's maybe the underlying assumption. Of course, when you go against that, of course you won't be accepted as. At one point in time, you will no longer be accepted as the leader. But because that level of expectation on you as the moral leader forces you, at least it forced me to also be that moral leader that they expect me to be. And to also take care of my organization, take care of the people in my organization, right? So that was already my own inherent beliefs, but it was also the expectation that I got from the organization. Now, in Europe, I find it's a lot more difficult because the expectation of me here I'm not being seen as the leader, I'm being seen as the boss. It's a significant distinction there, and this is not just here in Belgium where I'm now. I experienced the same in Australia. I experienced the same in the US. I experienced the same in the Netherlands. So in a number of countries. And the basic assumption that all people have is that as the boss, I'm going to be directive. As the boss, I'm going to be transactional to my people. As the boss, I'm inherently probably not a good person because, I use people to make money. So right, and of course it's never black and white. It's never 100%. So if you zoom in, you will find a lot of individuals in Asia that would look different from what I was describing just now, and in Europe. But this is kind of the common situation. So for me, if I do that, I try to, take care of the people. I try to do the same thing that in Asia. I get a very different response. First, I get either I get kind of distrustful. You're only doing this because you want something, or when they discover it, it's not. This is really, my own willingness to do so. Then people start really lying down on the couch and tell me all their problems, and they expect me to be a therapist, and they will stop doing all their other responsibility. They won't stop taking responsibility for the organization. They just start behaving like a patient. In Asia, I've had many deep discussions with a lot of people that had problems at home or problems at work, but it was always, okay, I have a problem here. We talk it through, we solve it, and then we continue with our responsibilities for the group. Here, I often get situations where people then, because now I have problems, I'm sick or I have something, so I'm exempted now for taking responsibility for the group. That never happened to me in Asia. So I think the difficulties that you see with those leaders in the companies that you work with, it's also a lot of it, in my experience, is due to the expectations you get from the organization.
I think that's very helpful, very, very helpful. Jeff, we're coming to an end. It's been really fascinating talking to you. I end my podcast by asking my guests a question. I ask them what they think can help us to lead a good life and to create a good society. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what it means to live a good life and create a good society from your perspective.
I would say challenge your assumptions. Any assumption you have, always challenge it, whether it's positive or negative. Always challenge your assumptions, and never take your assumptions as permanent facts. I think for me that has always worked well.
Very good. That's a very nice way to end, Jeff. Thank you very much for being our guest. It's been really great having you. Look forward to speaking to you soon. Take care.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Edgy Ideas. If you enjoyed our podcast and would like more information about our coaching, training, and events, please contact simon@analyticnetwork.com or go to www.analyticnetwork.com. Thank you for listening.